Hungry Trilobyte podcast would like to start by acknowledging SoonerCon. Join us for Oklahoma's premier pop culture convention. SoonerCon returns June 20th through 22nd, 2025. This will be the 33rd year for SoonerCon, and this year will bring even more cosplay, celebrity guests, kids' workshops, gaming, comic art, and after-hours events. Visit SoonerCon.com for details. We are recording in my podcast studio with Bougnher III. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, my friend. How are you?
I am doing great. I am glad to have you here. I am excited about this topic, for one thing, because we're going to talk about a golden age comic artist by the name of Howard Boughner.
Yes, we are.
And you have a particular association with this person.
Yes, I do. He was my grandfather.
That is something that I can't stress enough. We don't have enough people to talk about when it comes to golden age artists. So I'd really like to know what your insights are as far as what kind of an artist he was and what kind of a person he was.
Well, that's the thing. Growing up, when I was little, I had no concept of the fact that Grandpa was famous or that he did anything of note. I just knew he drew a lot, and that, as I got older, I learned that he did a comic strip, he did one-page funnies for Fawcett Publications, stuff like that. But I didn't, when I was little, I didn't have a concept of that he was famous. I think my sister still doesn't have that concept, I know for me, 1978 will always be a pivotal year for me. My grandparents came to visit. We were living in Norristown, Pennsylvania at the time. We were living in Plymouth Meeting. They came to visit. My grandpa Howard brought me a Batman comic that he bought from a newsstand. And I shall not, and that's the thing, I don't remember if it was a newsstand or a comic book store he went to. I'm pretty sure it was a newsstand because that would be his mode of thinking, having come from the golden age where comic books were sold at newsstands, as opposed to comic book stores. I think that's where he got it. He brought it, we read it together. That was my first foray into comics. And, he learned that I was watching the Batman 60s TV show after school and thought Batman would be a good fit for my first comic. And he was right. I mean, my name is Bat for a reason, and so, this thing that I want to impress upon is, as the years went on, I didn't just learn an appreciation for comic books, I learned an appreciation for literature and art. And I think when you look at today's comic artists, comic writers, some of the artistry is there, some of it's lost. There's a show I like to watch that has a great episode. I'm not going to mention the show, but the conversation comes up: are comic books literature, or are they just trash? When you look at the golden age of comics, why they're so expensive is not the low numbers that they published it, because at the peak of the 40s, in the early 40s rather, the peak of Batman, Superman's popularity, in the peak of their popularity in the 40s, they were publishing 1 million to 2 million copies per issue each month. It's the fact that when collected for the war effort, mothers would throw comic books into the paper bin. That's the first thing they would toss into the paper bin, and they would be shipped overseas and left on the battlefield. I mean, soldiers would read them, but they'd get left on the barracks, they'd get left on the battlefield, and they'd get thrown in the trash when the barracks was cleaned up, and so that actually lowered the numbers. And so my grandfather did stuff like We Willie Win and Judge Smudge, Headline Harry, Dizzy Daisy, Itsy and Bitsy. Neat little sidebar is Itsy and Bitsy is actually my aunt and her best friend Peggy.
Oh, okay.
They were the inspiration for the comics. My My grandmother was the inspiration for Mrs. B, the working wife, the comic strip in the 60s. You know, and that was done at a time where women didn't go really into the workforce and fathers didn't stay home. But he had a stay at home job, and he was, my auntie was born, I believe, when my grandfather was 49, in his 40s. And so he stayed home and took, when it was safe for my grandma to go to work, she would go to work. But when my aunt was little, he would stay at home, and she would watch him draw. And kids would come from the neighborhood. Oh, can you draw this? Can you draw that? Can you draw me? That sort of thing. I remember one year for Christmas, I got a hand drawn Christmas card, and I got a hand drawn card that said "My name means farmer," and it was a hand done drawing of a farmer. And so, it's things like that. You know, um, I remember being 10 years old and being in elementary school and going to see Julius Caesar with my dad. And I bugged, pleaded, and threw a fit for about 3 weeks until somebody got me a copy of the book. I remember reading that in free reading period and getting suspended for 3 days because it was deemed above my reading level comprehension. It was above my age. When you look at Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, Captain America, Thor, the Avengers, X-Men, you talk about that is primarily kids stuff. But when you get into The Dark Knight Returns, Dark Knight Strikes Again, Sin City, Mouse, Ghost World, you get into Watchmen, you get into a more adult, more mature audience for the reader. And I think when you talk about when I was growing up, there was really no bridge in between what is acceptable for kids to read as comics and was more acceptable for adults. There was really no bridge in between.
True.
When you look at now, you've got DC kids, Marvel kids, those are designed for 5 to 8 year olds. But when you talk about, like I said, when you talk about now, you talk about there are comic books with a rating now, and there is just about every conceivable step along the way in age group that you can think of. They've got that covered. It really fills me with joy when I see when I'm walking about town and I'm on a bus or something, and I see a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old reading a comic book. My grandfather believed that comics were the cornerstone of better reading. And, as evidenced by me reading Julius Caesar at the age of 10, I think that when you look at the legacy of the Golden Age of comics, it really is that whimsical fantasy, that morality play that just seeps into your subconscious. You don't really know that you're being taught a lesson, but that lesson is still there. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I still love about comic books is that it still has the ability to educate.
And when you talk about the comic strips and the publications, single panels, we're talking about a lot of the stuff that you would see in, say, the newspaper or an evening magazine, and in some cases, maybe in some wider publications. But we're talking comic strips that were more dailies almost. But I don't want to forget the fact that he was able to work on some DC comics as well, some things in the Captain Marvel family that our audience would be more familiar with.
Okay, well, and what people may not know is Captain Marvel actually came from Fawcett Publications. Mm-hmm. They're the ones that created the character, and he didn't work primarily on Captain Marvel. He worked on Captain Marvel Jr., Captain Marvel Family, and the Adventures of Captain Marvel, and his thing was doing funnies that were the inserts in the middle. He wrote and drew them, Judge Smudge was a very popular one. Headline Harry was another popular title that would fit in the Captain Marvel Jr. Very nicely in the middle.
The point I was getting at was that Captain Marvel and those little funny comics that they would insert into the older comics, which we don't really see as much anymore. That is an excellent bridge, like you were saying, to bring younger readers into the comic world and then into the literature world as a whole.
Oh, agreed. And we don't see that anymore. We don't see that in comics anymore, and that, to me, that's a shame, because the thing that I loved about my grandpa was his ability to make me laugh at just about every turn. And one of the things that I miss about comics is humor. Some still have the humor. When you look at Deadpool, there's a lot of tongue-in-cheek humor in Deadpool. But, I mean, Alfred used to be the comic relief in Batman, and they kind of took that away. Kind of made it a more serious tone. And where that has its place, and that's all well and good, because we're evolving into something here. I miss the humor of, there is a comment that my grandfather did for Judge Smudge, where this guy's talking to the judge about how his nephew's girlfriend is in jail, got arrested for stealing a mink coat, or a mink stole rather, and the judge and he says, my nephew's in jail, and the judge's like, I thought it was his girlfriend. Why is he in jail? He took the rap.
Yeah.
Puns like that.
And again, that's the kind of thing you might have seen in a newspaper daily, but they would also insert them into actual comics you'd buy, just as a half page or a quarter page, just to give the kids a little variety. And I almost want to say, and I'm not going to say, but I almost want to say that we've kind of fleshed that out a little bit, because now you can go to the comic store and you can buy a whole comic based on Looney Tunes or another very young kid-oriented property. And that's nice, but I agree with you in that the mainstream comics seem to have lost their sense of humor to a large degree. And that's a shame.
Well, I agree, because, when you look at the stuff that he did, my grandpa did, had a lot of humor to it. I mean, he turned me on to comic strips like Beetle Bailey, Hagar the Horrible, High and Lois, and Peanuts, because he knew these guys. He worked with them. He knew them. He was friends with them, and that just blows my mind. On a personal note, my grandma telling me that guys like Bob Kane and Bill Finger used to come over for dinner just blows my mind, because I can't imagine being a 10-year-old kid and reading Batman and just not losing my mind over the idea that Bob Kane is in my kitchen.
Right. And to be clear, these meetings would happen far before your time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But the fact that it happened at all is remarkable.
But, I mean, I remember I had to ask my grandpa. He got me a Beetle Bailey collection book, and I had asked him about this one joke. Like, Eddie is at the tavern, and he's ordering breakfast. And the chef says, what did you have in mind? And like Eddie says, how about a French toast? And he hoists up a glass and says, a ventre santé. And his humor like that was right up his alley. That's the stuff that I grew up on. That helped shape my sense of humor. I cannot, like I said, I can't stress enough that we are in a wonderful place where comics are plentiful. And, like I said, it makes me smile when I see a kid reading a comic, because that tells me that the parents know something. They understand something. They comprehend that this is not trash. this is literature. This is something that the kid likes to do. This is enjoyable.
So I've been thinking about this for a couple minutes, and I probably can't put it off any longer. If your grandfather were able to see the comics industry as it is now, what do you think his take would be on it?
He'd be confused.
Okay.
He'd really be confused. One, I don't think he ever intended to be famous. Would have been nice, have a bigger paycheck, that sort of thing. But, I think he'd be confused because I don't think I know that he didn't really consider his work to be of really any real worth of value. Nor do I think he had any idea that the comic industry would blossom the way it is. Two, I know, going around different places talking to people like you that know who he is, that know his work or have seen his work in print, it would confuse him because he just didn't think of himself that way. I always get a giggle when I talk to somebody about his work, and they're like, "Oh yes, I know that name," or "Yes, I know that specific work," or "I know that specific publication." And I get a giggle because I know that Grandpa Howard would not understand that his work matters to people. He just never really considered himself to be that kind of person or have that kind of value for his work. He was honored to be in the Cartoonist Society of America. The Cartoonist Society of America, rather. He was honored. Mm-hmm. He was very confused by it because, he didn't consider himself to be on the level of Joel Schultz or Mort Walker or Dick Brown or even Stan Lee. But in my opinion, his work is just as influential.
Was it that humility that kind of pushed him to release the How to Draw volumes that he did do and that a lot of people seem to know him for?
I think so. I think it was really a matter of just trying to get work any way he can. I know that talking to my aunt, he used to write gags for the guy who did Nancy. And there was she told me the story and I forgot the specific gag, but it had to do, was on a beach. And he wrote it down, he sent it in, and he made like $15 off the gag, which $15 at that time was a pretty good chunk of change too. But, I think for him, it was just a matter of trying to get another job, trying to get a paycheck to come into the house.
Mm-hmm. And I don't want to shortchange that because, especially in those early days, and it hasn't gotten that much better, getting work any way you can was a very valuable skill just to survive in the industry.
Oh, agreed. He, and like I said, he worked at home a lot. And so, half the mothers were envious that he could do that, and the other half were like, kind of like, well, why isn't he at work? Why is she at work? Because we're talking the 50s and 60s, and that wasn't really something that was done. Mm-hmm. But it worked. It worked for him, and, timing is everything. If Mrs. B, the Working Wife had come out 10 years later, it would have been seen as a strike for women's rights. Would have been a blow for women's rights. But he didn't get the credit he deserved, I think, for making a blow for women's rights, saying that it's okay that his wife went to work.
That would have been a bombshell at that point in time, for sure. It just wasn't the kind of thing, I mean, not that I was there, but just the conventional wisdom, and you can see it in all literature at the time, is that it's this major idea that, should we even, quote unquote, let the women go out and work? And to, for an artist like that to just kind of present a work that says, well, yeah, why not? Making it uncontroversial was controversial.
Right.
And it's just remarkable. I bring it up because it seems like, especially when we talk about the legends, the giants in the industry of the early days, when we ever mention that, oh, well, they took a side gig somewhere else, it's always like we're there's this idea that we're devaluing their work, and I hate that. Because, like, no, they had to earn a living too, and sometimes it was not doing what they wanted to do.
Well, that's the thing is, I know, I'm hesitant to mention one company. My grandfather had a disdain for one company. He didn't like the way the workers were treated. And he didn't like the fact that they were using literary works to create their own version of it, and by doing so, systematically eradicating the memory of the original literary work. He didn't, and so he never worked for that company.
Mm-hmm. We don't need to name names. That's okay.
Right. But but you're absolutely right. There were, if you watch, there's a documentary on Stan Lee. If you watch it, he didn't start out being the powerhouse creator or publisher. He started out, I think, in the mailroom,
Mm-hmm.
of Timely Comics, and so, when you think about you mentioned the Giants, and you talk about guys like Steve Ditko and Stan Lee and Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, Bob Kane and Bill Finger being some of the early giants of the industry. You're right. They still had to work. They still had to make a living, and they still had to do what they needed to do in order to survive. And if working in the mailroom is what's going to get you there, if working flipping burgers at White Castle is going to get you where you're going,
Mm-hmm.
or where you want to go, rather, then that's what you got to do. My grandpa was caught up, I think, in kind of a weird time warp where he did what he had to do in order to survive and put food on the table. And that led to some jobs that he may not like. And I think for him, the work was rewarded. I know Playmates Magazine is where Itsy and Bitsy was. And that was, for him, that was a big deal because it was a national publication. He was able to bring his voice to a wider audience than what he was used to in the 60s.
So let's get back to you knowing him personally.
Okay.
Because that's all valuable, but I have to, because this is a chance to say, he's past his career. He gets to just spend time with his grandson. And is there just a moment where he knows you like comics, and he knows you're actually picking up not only artistry of it, but the literary value, and he just starts filling you in?
I think it was at the age of 10, around 9 or 10. I started watching Dragon Ball Z, Voltron, and Robotech. And we had a conversation about Japanese animation and what he liked and what he didn't like about it. And I started talking about what I liked about it. I liked the fighting, and I liked the exaggerated emotions in it, the exaggerated faces, things like that. I thought Dragon Ball was a really cool cartoon, and you had a lot of fight sequences, but you also had the, you had the over-exaggerated emotions, the over-exaggerated facial expressions, and I think it was at that point that we really started to connect on that level, where he realized that it just wasn't a hobby. It was something I understood, something I enjoyed, and something that was probably going to be a part of who I am as a teenager and an adult.
Mm-hmm.
I know that when I was younger, about 8 or 9, he started buying me Haggle the Horrible and Beetle Bailey collections, and they were in these little books about yay big, nothing like what you see now. They look like a regular paperback. That you would find in the fiction section. They're a little thinner than your average novel, but he started buying me those, and like I said, the joke with Lucky Eddie, I had to ask him what it meant. And again, I think it's stuff like that he started to realize that he had a kindred spirit. My grandpa was someone who would talk to anybody long as they thought back. That skipped a generation. I'm definitely that guy,
Mm-hmm.
And so For me, like I said, about 9 or 10 years old that we really started to connect on that level.
Wow. Okay. Do you remember conversations or techniques he would have shown you, or at least described, that he knew you would appreciate that somebody else might not?
Okay, we talked about Stanley. We talked about Marvel. I was about 11, 12 years old, and we talked about Marvel, and we talked about the techniques, the artistry techniques that guys like Steve Ditko and John Romita Sr. and Jack Kirby were using. Um, if you look at the nose structure of Betty Brant, it's very similar to the nose structure of Itsy and Bitsy. It's a little more fleshed out. You can denote nostrils and one that doesn't look like just a triangle, but there are similarities in the nose structure that were what he said was, you start with the basic triangle and then you want to do some 3D shade. With just some shading, you want to round it out to a more 3D image, but it all starts in the same process.
That's, and then looking at some of his work, I mean, a lot of his single panels do have a more simplistic, but not. They don't have the same degree of shading that you would see in, say, a comic book panel. They're more designed for the quick gag.
Right.
And that's, being able to show you and appreciate the difference. I really wish I could be a fly on that wall.
Again, I would say, I'll say that I didn't grow up with the concept of him being famous.
Sure.
Or that his work was, anything that people knew. I didn't come across that until my adult years. Mm-hmm. Going to comic conventions, going to comic book stores, talking to people. But I just knew for me that my grandpa understood why I liked these things. And for me, that was the highlight of any visit. And he lived in Cleveland. We lived in Florida, we lived in Pennsylvania, and then we moved to New England, But he lived in Cleveland. He was born in Cadillac, he was born in Michigan. I believe in Cadillac is where he was born. But he moved to Cleveland with my grandma, and so we didn't get to see him that often. But I know for me, the highlight of any visit was discussing art, discussing comics, discussing art, discussing what works in today's comics and what doesn't. I remember I was 14, maybe 15, if I'm remembering correctly. They came to visit, and I was down from school for the weekend. And we were talking about graphic novels, because graphic novels were now becoming a thing. And he said to me, this is something that's going to change the industry, because the artistry is much more mature. The writing is much more mature. The audience is going to be much more mature, but this is something that's going to change the industry because it's something outside the box. I don't think he ever read Watchmen. I don't think he ever read Sin City. I don't think he ever read any of that. But I knew that he was aware of it.
Do you think he would have at least appreciated the idea of these really heavy-handed stories being put in the hands of the mainstream and, I don't want to say young kids, but kids that maybe wouldn't have had access to it prior to that?
I think he would have definitely appreciated that.
Okay.
Largely because, like I said, he believed that comics were the cornerstone to better reading. And when you look at the story structure, the sentence structure, if you look at the character structure in most graphic novels, particularly in the mid to late 80s, it was leaps and bounds above and beyond what we had seen in mainstream comics. I remember reading to him the Dark Horse, Dark Empire, Star Wars. I brought it with me, and it was tattered. It was tattered and torn. Pages were coming loose, and that's how much I read it. And I remember reading it to him, and he said, "Well, I don't think I know anything about this Star Wars, but I like the story."
That should be on a T-shirt somewhere.
But because that was, and I remember just saying, "Oh, Grandpa."
Now, you've done a pretty good job at presenting your grandfather's work in a way that other people can follow it through a certain Facebook group.
Yes. The Art of Howard Boughner is a group that my aunt and I both run. It's a Facebook group that we both run. It's got a lot of his artwork, a lot of his comics that are up there. Willie Wynn is up there. But there's also some Christmas cards that he did that my aunt has contributed photos of. We have a lot of subscribers. I mean, a lot of people follow it, rather. We have a lot of followers. Not a lot of content because, it's still a work in progress.
Mm-hmm. What kind of response have you gotten from the general public on this?
There is a guy who wants to do a featured article in a magazine on it, and I'm not sure where we're at with that currently. I know he reached out and has contacted my aunt. The response that we've gotten has been overwhelmingly positive. There are older generation. There's even younger generation people. There are people that are younger than me responding and saying, "Hey, I like this. This is pretty cool."
So if people want to follow you and follow the work of your grandfather, where's the best place you could send them, in addition to this group, which I will link to in the show notes?
Okay. That would be the best way.
Okay.
That'd be the best way. My full name is Boughner III. The page that we have is The Art of Howard Boughner. They can get a hold of me or my aunt either way, that way.
Okay. I want to thank you so much for being here, for introducing and helping me break in the new studio, and I'd be glad to have you back anytime.
Oh, thank you, Aaron. Appreciate it.